Welcome to part 2 of this Frontline special. Our Frontline films usually focus on the current battlefield situation somewhere in Ukraine. This one will be a little different. If you're interested in small arms, don't go away, because this is all about small arms, and not just any guns. In part 1, we test-fired and discussed 2 submachine guns from the 1940s, the legendary MP40 Schmeiser and the Swedish-designed Special K. In part 2, we'll be looking at 3 examples of arguably the greatest family of weapons in history. They can also trace their roots back to the Second World War. It is, of course, the AK series of assault rifles. You might wonder what the link is between these remarkable guns. It's quite simple yet extraordinary. They were all captured from Russian forces by a special unit of the Ukrainian army, led by our friend Lt Oleh. They're what is known as trophy weapons. We'll see Oleg test-firing the AKs at a makeshift range just behind the Donbass front line. And helping us to understand their development and significance is one of the world's leading experts on 20th and 21st century small arms.
I'm Jonathan Ferguson. I'm Keeper of Firearms and Artillery here at the Royal Armouries Museum in the UK. One of the best collections of arms and armour in the world, and the UK's National Museum of Arms and Armour. And we're going to be taking a look at some interesting weapons captured in Ukraine with some examples from our collection, and we're going to have a bit of a chat about them.
This is what we saw. The first example of the AK series was designed by the Russian inventor Mikhail Kalashnikov during what the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War. Later it became known as the AK-47, after the year when the first prototype emerged. Since then, these guns have been made in their hundreds of millions. No war has been fought since the 1950s without Kalashnikovs being fielded by one side or another, or often both, as is the case here in Ukraine. For all the drones, hypersonic missiles and other 21st century firepower, this is still a war of opposing Kalashnikovs. So let's go to the range where Oleg has his trophies. The first weapon to be shot is an AK-74, perhaps the most common type of assault rifle on the Ukrainian battlefield.
What is this? It's in command.
Ну опять сломал. Да что ж такое?
Ну так. Ну это классика.
Oleg likes this rifle. He feels at home with it, understandably.
АК-74 сама розповсюджена зброя на сьогоднішній день. 74-го року випуска. Різниця між АК-47 і АК-74 – це калібр 7,62 і 5,45. Доволі проста, надійна, але не точна.
Next up is the AK-12. This is the most modern iteration of the Kalashnikov dynasty. And this is what he thought.
АК-12 легше. Мені навіть здалося, що трошки легше спуск. І хороший наворот, те, що тут є ще додаткова функція стрільба двойкою, 2 постріли. Можна робити 2 постріли і одиночний. Ну, це сучасна російська зброя. 24 рік дуже часто зустрічається у противника.
As we wait for the final AK, other soldiers from Oleg's unit have a go. This is the AK-200. It's an export variant of the AK family, which seems to have found its way back into the Russian army, here in Ukraine, before being captured.
Костя, как он у тебя пристреленный нашел?
Он не пристрелен вообще.
Вообще не пристрелен, да?
У меня оптика не пристрелена, я все никак не выеду нормально пристрелять.
Я с механики
чтобы заняться
стреляю.
этим.
Тут тоже идет... А, нет, тут один.
Не, тут автомат и одиночный, обычный. Будешь?
Oleg is interested, but not particularly impressed.
Не с Макса, не с
АК-200. Все те ж саме, як і в 12-му, і в АК-47, ну просто інший навіс. І мені навіть здається, що він трошки важчий. Може за рахунок приклада та оптики, ну так. Да. Все те ж саме. Скажи, що я не спеціаліст по стрілковому оружию.
That's why we've invited Jonathan Ferguson at the Royal Armouries in Leeds to give us his undoubtedly expert opinion on these guns and their history. Well, we're going to move out of the 1940s now. Well, not really. That's a silly thing to say, because we're moving on to probably the greatest family of small arms, sort of rifles at least, that we've seen and we continue to see on the battlefield. Now, Oleg was firing a number of varieties of the AK family. He had a 74, a 12 and a 200. Now you have got a AK-74 here, and you've got a couple of other, more than a couple of other members of the family and one of its maybe cousins, which you're going to talk about. But could we go to the AK-74 first, and you maybe just give us a little bit of the history of the Kalashnikov?
Of course, yeah. So as you rightly say, the rifle in the video is pretty standard AK-74, except somebody, and I assume it's the separatists that had it originally, have replaced this bit with a more modern this bit. It's called the top cover. As you alluded to, this was designed in the 40s originally as the AK. 1959 the AKM comes along, which is substantially this, and then it's redesigned for the 5.45 cartridge in the 70s, hence AK-74, which gives you this slightly straighter magazine and this muzzle brake device on the end. That's how we look at that and say that's a 74. But somebody's replaced this,
Okay.
which makes some sense. There were various AKs in service from the 50s onwards with a rail on the side for a night sight. Really the only type of optical sight going at that time, and doesn't seem to have been issued a heck of a lot. I guess equivalent of Special Operations Forces would certainly have had access to it. And that side rail becomes more prolific as the variants go on. So for example, just to show you what I mean, this is a later export, shorter version of part of this family, basically.
Yeah.
And all of that range comes as standard with this type of rail.
Okay.
That puts a sight over the top of the weapon with sort of a breeze between it, and was the preferred way of doing it by the Soviets and by the Russians. However, it's not sort of the modern way. So what we see here, they've done essentially what we've done to this, which we use for occasional shooting purposes. And to make life easier for the people that shoot it, we have done the same thing. It won't be the same exact one.
Which model is this?
So this is actually a throwback. This is the AKM, back to the 7.62 by 39 cartridge, which is the classic banana-shaped magazine, and no brake on the end. That's a recoil thing, by the way. That pulls the gun forward with its own exhaust gases, as it were,
Right.
against the recoil of the cartridge. Very effective. Really fitted that Soviet doctrine of firing bursts from the shoulder, aimed bursts as you advance toward the enemy.
Okay.
Nobody else really did that because it's quite obnoxious to have that blast and flash right next to your mates' heads if they happen to be nearby. But yeah, we've done the same thing. So this is just an aftermarket, probably off the internet, top cover, and they've replaced the rear sight with a pivot, and you put the pivot there, and you've got a top cover that you can lift up and get to the guts if you need to, but you can fit. We've got a red dot sight and a magnifier on this one. He had a different sight in the video, but that's just to illustrate that even these legacy, what you might call legacy platforms, the 74 and the AKM, and I believe the AKM and the 7.62 family is still being used out there as well. Some people prefer the bigger, heavier bullet. Right. They can all be modernised to a greater or lesser extent at the expense of maybe how very heavy they become, and maybe reliability might be affected.
I think a lot of people don't realise it's just actually carting around the ammunition is a big factor.
Yep, which this was a great leap forward for, as it was with the M16 when the Americans came up with that. This is very much a reaction. If the M16 is arguably a reaction to the AK, the AK-74 is a reaction to the M16, scaling down the bullet, making the cartridge a little bit lighter and the trajectory a bit flatter.
Could we talk? I mean, talk
and the recoil lower as well.
Yeah. We talk a little bit about the impact. We're talking about AKs and why they're still. I mean, it's like still having Spitfires over the battlefield.
It really is, yeah.
Because it's as you say, it was designed in the 1940s and it's been developed and upgraded.
So originally, they're introduced as a direct replacement for these things, for the submachine guns. It's a sort of, I keep using this term, picked up from the British military, but Gucci. It's a fancier, more capable submachine gun. So some Soviet units were up to sort of platoon level, were fully equipped with submachine guns, and they would advance while firing, and you get a devastating firepower, a base of fire from your own submachine guns. They thought, well, we can do that, but better, with a scaled down rifle cartridge that lets us use it as a submachine gun, but a bit further away. But they soon realised, and they're supposed to come into service with the SKS carbine, which was going to be the standard rifle, semi-automatic, in theory a bit accurate and better range, but actually it turned out that it wasn't. And the AK did both those jobs very well. So whereas China stuck with the SKS for longer, the Soviet Unions went, we're just going to buy AKs, and sort of bin off the SKS to a secondary role. And what was introduced as a super submachine gun, if you like, becomes what it was really inspired by, the German assault rifle concept.
Right. But it becomes the main weapon of the infantryman.
Yep. And everyone takes note of that. Everyone, the Eastern Bloc, obviously, because they've got easy access to this technology. But the West is looking as well, going, maybe we've jumped the wrong way with things like the M14 and the FAL and the G3. Really hard to control an automatic, We've been relying on submachine guns and machine guns for our automatic firepower. Are we looking in the wrong direction? Meanwhile, on the eastern side of things, well, firstly, it's a very sound design. For 1949, when they first start making it, the prototype's 47. It's really cutting edge, good stuff. But it isn't just that. They're giving them out to anyone that will support the aims of the Soviet Union, or they're selling them very cheap. They are giving out the license to manufacture them in your own country, probably for free as well, maybe both. And so it's the proliferation of the thing is a mixture of it being very good and without the standards of a sort of professional army maintenance level and supply chain, it can be more reliable. I'm heavily caveating the old chestnut that the AK is super bomb-proof reliable. Mm-hmm. It pretty much is, but there's more to it. If you're a professional armed service and you're cleaning twice a day, probably doesn't matter. But if you're anything less capable than that, yeah, it's a boon to have it.
Well, it's the classic sort of insurgency weapon, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's simple. People talk about it being cheap, but you have to be able to tool up to make this. Then again, it's early on. It's relying on traditional wood, not polymer. The first version is old-fashioned machine, or the first widely proliferated version is machined metal. So it's a sort of, the learning curve to get it into mass production is easier. It's closer to World War II technology than something like, well, famously the M16, which is modern. Although not that much more modern. The first AR-15 prototype is 1957. So it's only another decade on. In
your opinion, I was going to ask you about its weaknesses or perceived weaknesses, but compare it with, I guess, AR-15, or would it be its main?
That's the classic
rivalry.
Spitfire Messerschmitt.
So, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that? How it compared with the Western catch-up attempts, which were the AR-15 family? Yeah.
So the GIs and Marines run into giving every soldier portable automatic firepower And in a jungle setting, that was a real boon. You know, the ability to shoot out to at least 300 meters plus, but at close range, empty a 30-round magazine. You know, the M14 is it's not controllable and automatic, even if you get the selector switch fitted, which they didn't because they knew it wasn't worth it. So you've got a semi-automatic rifle with only 20 rounds on board before you have to reload. And these guys are coming up against, well, various weapons, but the AK included, 30-round mag, automatic fire. So they certainly developed the impression that it's more capable. Whether it is or it isn't, I would broadly argue that it was a better choice, certainly for the jungle. And so there's a weird bit of history where the Army's very resistant to anything that isn't the M14 because it's homegrown and they like that distance and power of a full power, slower firing rifle. But the US Air Force ends up being used as the way to get this thing in the back door, and it gets adopted as a jungle rifle, as it does in the UK, by the way. The UK Armed Forces in 1964 also adopt the AR-15 as a jungle. Mm-hmm. The difference being the Brits stick to that plan and they don't adopt it to replace their sort of unnecessarily powerful rifle, if we can put it that way. The Americans end up going all in on it and dumping their own service rifle after only 7 years of frontline service for that M16, and it's really, I think, in large part because of this, or rather its forebear.
Yeah, the AK. Well, you've got a couple of other AK derivatives or members of the family, but then we'll come to this one last. But can you tell us about which models these two?
Yeah, so I've thrown in, we are lacking, I have to admit. We have 27,000 firearms, but we don't have the AK-12 and we don't have the AK-200, which we saw in your footage there. The presence of the 200 I was particularly...
Well, you mentioned this before. Why were you surprised?
So the AK-200 series, we've got the 100 series here. So the AK-74M, which is this with plastic furniture, the sight rail, and handy dandy folding buttstock, which is borrowed from an earlier variant. The AK-74 becomes the baseline model of a new series called the AK-100 series, and that is Kalashnikov Concern, as they later rebrand, trying to update it as a product and sell it to as many people as possible. Mm-hmm. And yes, the 74M is for the Russian army. This, by the way, is why we see in 2022 even, the Ukraine armed forces are still equipped with, well, a mixture of these with wooden furniture, and this with the updated glass reinforced polymer. Same sort of polymer that you see on Glock pistol frames or whatever.
And remind us, which model is this?
So this is still an AK-74.
Okay.
There was no difference in Russian and other former Soviet service. It's just the latest model off the production line. And so this is typically what we saw the Ukrainians with. It's got a fixed buttstock, so you can't make it shorter for convenience. It did not come, although there was a special variant of it, with that rail, so you've got no ability to put a magnifying sight or a red dot sight or a night sight on there. Still, this one was made in 1988, still the baseline model didn't have that feature.
This is pretty basic.
It still is, yeah. The only upgrade is easier to maintain, cheaper plastic furniture, but for the soldier there's no difference there. This laminated wood with varnish on it doesn't really need any looking after by the soldier. That's an armourer's concern. So you've saved the armourer some headache, and you've saved some pennies on manufacturing laminate furniture versus moulded plastic. So this really was no functional upgrade at all, and the Ukrainians were ever so slightly behind the curve on the small arms there by being stuck with that. Whereas the Russians had standardized on the big version of this, the full-length 16-inch barrel, but with the, again, plastic furniture, but the folding stock, and you've got an optical sight rail. Of course, what we saw is that there was not a huge utilization of the sight rails, unless they were special operations forces, perhaps. So at the end of the day, even the 74M wasn't a huge upgrade.
So forgive me, Jonathan, this is the AK-100 or?
So this particular variant that we have is the AK-105, and that's one of this range of export-oriented AKs. That's not to say that some units, Spetsnaz notably, especially if they like perhaps they like the older cartridge, so there's a 100 flavour in the older cartridge as well. But I believe they also quite like this version for its shorter barrel length. So they're in limited service, but the standard model was still the 74. But by 2022, of course, we had the AK-12 in service. The AK-200 is sort of the missing link there. So there was another new range of export-oriented rifles in the 200 series. So all the same features, but with more in the ability to attach stuff to it. So again, a rail system built into the weapon rather than off to the side, and rails on your handguard, much as we saw in Afghanistan on the SA-80, came in 2008-ish, upgrading older systems to take lasers, lights, vertical grips, that kind of thing. So the 200 not adopted by the mainstream Russian military. So that's why I say it's a little surprising. Then again, all sorts of ways in which someone could have got hold of that. You know, a colonel of a regiment could get his credit card out and buy some, I guess. Because they proliferated onto the wider illicit and licit market, yes. They could have got there. They could have gone away and come back even, you know. So I shouldn't have been surprised by that. But you can see the 200 as I think Oleg makes it, and I think he makes this point, it's sort of a bridging of the gap. It's an upgrade of this level of technology to the slightly better, toward the AK-12. And although he kind of emphasizes, I think that the AK-12 is superior, I wouldn't see a huge gulf, really.
But is the 12, is that kind of, at the moment, the last word in AK technology?
Depending which country you're dealing with, yes. So because we don't have the AK-12, which that had a tortured development process that I won't bore you with, but the version that entered service, that's been modified twice as well, with lessons learned from the conflict in Ukraine. Notably, it came in with a 2-round burst function. That had been done away with. In fact, there was a whole separate rifle, which we have called the AN-94, which was geared around 2 rounds very, very fast. And that sort of failed and went away. So it was a little bizarre that it came back. But it was for nothing, because they found that there wasn't enough sort of real estate on this very slim receiver here. And adding another setting meant that it could over-rotate and pop off, and then your gun doesn't work. Okay. So that's one of the changes that's been made to the AK-12. So although we don't have those yet, we're keeping an eye on the development of it. But they're not the only country that's modernized the AK, of course.
Finally, Jonathan has brought along something relevant to what we've just been seeing, but it shows how the AK family has spun off and influenced other rifles. And this one is certainly influenced by the AK family, but it's manufactured in Poland.
That's right.
As recently, I think it came into service in the 1990s.
That's right.
Definitely post-Soviet.
This is their Model 96, WZ96, Polish standard issue Polish Army rifle today, although it is gradually being replaced by a more modern scratch design system. Poland, being in the orbit of the Soviet Union, had its own flavour of AK-74, as we've seen, and they iterated that into something with accessory rails on the front, but also this. They went for a very strong bridge-type girder affair over the top of the receiver, maybe making it a bit heavier than the AK-12, but let's say a bit more robust than at least the first attempt. It's quite hard to. We had the same problem with the British Army's L1A1 SLR. Yes. These 1940s, 50s designs were not designed to have an optical sight over the top of them. So they have these thin sheet metal rickety covers that are only, they're not rickety, but they're there to protect the action from dirt and sand and mud and all of that. They're not there to stick stuff to. So the Polish solution was a bit more over-engineered, arguably. The Russians would certainly say it's over-engineered, in that this isn't going anywhere. You're not going to lose zero. So you put an optical sight on there, and this is not the Polish issue sight, by the way, it's an American one. And this is not going to shift slightly and cause your shots to move the more you access the innards, because you need to be able to do that. With the AK-12, reportedly, the optics, where fitted, are not necessarily going to maintain that zero, so your point of impact will potentially shift. This is what we understand. We've not done any testing on that. But this comes well before the AK-12. The AK-12 program is underway sort of 2014. Right. There's a false start with a totally different design where they're trying to redesign the architecture of the weapon to better suit things like accessories. And that doesn't work out. And they go back to the drawing board with the AK-200, 400 series, which is more of an incremental improvement like this. And they jump off from that and they come up with the AK-12 that we're seeing quite a bit now in Ukraine.
Can you tell us a little bit about the performance of this rifle?
Sure. So, I mean, this is only a sort of incremental improvement over what came before, but, you know, the ability to fit lights and lasers up here, optical sights here, without any loss of accuracy is a definite bonus. We have an ergonomic shaped grip here. You'll see the AK-12 has a similar take on this, fits the hand better. Mm-hmm. The old AK grip is rather skinny and weirdly shaped, so that's an improvement. And then both weapons feature an adjustable stock. On the WZ-96 here, the barrel, the upgraded barrel, this doesn't pivot. They've gone with very, very solid, and it just extends for body armor or different soldiers' body sizes. The AK-12 has followed more of the modern trend of it also folds, and there are different stock versions out there. That, in fact, we see that in your footage, 2 different stock types.
Yes, yes.
Which again are based on feedback from the field. There's also another improvement shared with, well, 2 improvements actually shared with the AK-12. Think of this as a sort of parallel universe take on the same ideas. There's this finger-operated selector and safety, whereas before you had to sort of muscle it up here. Now, with this modern idea of keeping the firing hand on the weapon at all times, you can sweep it down very quickly, and the AK-12 does the same thing. I could be wrong, but I believe it was an American company that first came up with this flange to allow that, and so both the Poles and the Russians have sort of potentially copied that, or at least been inspired by it. And then on the other side, we have here a left side selector, so that you can change, so you can do your safety with your finger, and there's less friction. And on this side, you use your thumb to operate the fire selector. Okay. And the same logic is applied to the AK-12. What isn't applied to the AK-12, although it is to the export versions, or export AKs in general, is the caliber.
That was my next question. You have to remind us, what caliber round is it using?
Yeah, so this is 5.56
okay.
by 45, aka 5.56 NATO. So this is a NATO AK, modernized, about as far as the AK is capable of being modernized. There are a couple of features on the AK-12 that the Russians would say are taking it even beyond this. But the point is, the AK being a ubiquitous platform, lots of different countries and armed forces were looking at modernizing theirs in parallel. Now, obviously, the Russians are the original designers of it, so you can regard theirs as definitive to that extent. But in terms of capability, there really isn't much to choose between 5.56 and 5.45, and the barrel length on this is the same sort of barrel length as the traditional AK-74. These are all competing on a very similar level.
This would be accurate out to what kind of range?
They're all going to be like 300 meters, yep, no problem at all, and as far beyond that as your skill allows. They're closer, these things are closer to the M16 AR-15 than many people realize. You know, in the right hands, they are 500 meter rifles, potentially further. There are nuances of design that broadly mean more AR-15s are more precise than more AKs are. There's a trend, it's a spectrum, but these are no slouch. You know, you're not, but the key feature here is the ability to fit an optical sight and have it not move about.
Yeah, well, yes, quite. It's not much of a sight if it does.
It's such a game changer. You know, the old story about the SA-80, for all the problems that had, as soon as you put a 4-power magnified optic on that, on any weapon, it just trounced everything that came before. They had to recalibrate the marksmanship scores because suddenly everyone was an expert. That's how significant optical sights are. So it's interesting, albeit, you know, not entertaining, to see how things are progressing in Ukraine and how some units do fit optical sights and are able to utilize them effectively. Others don't, and then we also see footage of guys who have them just reverting to looking over the weapon and firing on burst. You know, it's intriguing to see what works for the guys that actually use this stuff in anger.
Of the modern assault rifles that you have here, do you have a particular favorite?
I very much respect the Kalashnikov design. It's basically inarguably, like from my point of view as essentially a firearms historian, I don't think you can argue that there's a more significant rifle. But I think I have enough, probably growing up watching Vietnam War movies and silly 80s action movies, I have a bit of an affinity for the AR-15, M16 family.
Okay.
But I recognise that they're both products of their respective countries, design philosophies, supply chains, training, and all of that. And a bit like the old Spitfire Messerschmitt argument, it's the pilot or the shooter that matters way more than the weapon itself. So I try not to have favourites in that respect.
Our discussion is not just about the rifles. Jonathan takes us through the various different calibers of ammunition, which have been prevalent during the Kalashnikov era.
Okay, so first up here, we've got the very old now, 1904. This comes into service with the Luger pistol, sometimes called 9mm Luger for that reason. And it's used in both the submachine guns, and it's the default pistol cartridge and submachine gun cartridge to this day. It's extremely versatile. You can fit a lot of them in a magazine. It has good penetration, and it has enough diameter that you can do different things with the bullets if international law lets you. But
what exactly do you mean by that? Do you mean making marks into the bullet itself?
it's an allusion to the fact that, so ideally for a pistol cartridge, you would want hollow point bullets, so expanding bullets to increase the lethality. For land warfare between states, that's not legal. So this type of jacketed bullet is typically what you encounter. Also for shooting through a submachine gun, you're probably going to want to use that anyway because it's less likely to jam. So that's a fairly representative 9mm round. You can see how small that cartridge case is. You're not fitting very much propellant in there. So although that's bigger in diameter than an AK round, it is hitting at a much lower speed and doing a lot less damage. Most people shot with this type of cartridge, and that's any pistol cartridge, will survive if you can get them to a hospital in an hour. Most people, statistically. Wouldn't want to bet on it though.
Depends where you're shot.
It completely does, yeah. Which is the whole point of these others, is that it depends less where you're hit.
Yes, because of the kinetic energy.
Yeah. So we have here really the most common and maybe still the most important round used in the Kalashnikov series of rifles. It's 7.62mm in diameter, and the case length is 39mm. And this was the standard round all the way through to the 1970s for the Soviet forces, and well beyond that for a lot of other nations. So depending which part of the world you're fighting in, this is still very much the standard assault rifle cartridge, and certainly the standard AK cartridge. It is maybe ballistically less ideal than later, higher velocity, lighter bullets, but it certainly packs sufficient punch for most users, depending on what sort of bullet is loaded into it. But with any rifle caliber bullet, you're striking with 2,500 to 3,000 feet per second velocity. So whether it's a lighter bullet than this or this weight of bullet, it's going to create a very big, for want of a better word, splash in the human body, and it's going to stretch your tissues beyond what they can take, to put it bluntly. Something that a pistol caliber cartridge cannot achieve, but even a relatively small rifle cartridge like this certainly can. So it's more lethal, and you can still fit 30 rounds in admittedly quite a big magazine. So really the American and therefore NATO refinement of that concept of the so-called assault rifle cartridge, so a reduced length, reduced weight cartridge, so you can carry more of them. That was the idea with the AK round. This is the 5.56 NATO round, so a 45mm case length, a much slimmer, lighter bullet, but it's traveling up at that 3,000 feet per second velocity and clawing back a lot of that lost weight, if that makes sense. So bullets are doing damage either by the diameter of the bullet and the mass of the bullet, or by the sheer velocity of it. If you could propel a speck of metal at 27,000 feet per second, you would be getting significant lethality. It's that pushing apart of the human body, the tissues of the human body, that this does well, and it allows it, all things being equal, to operate on the level of something like a 7.62 NATO cartridge, arguably, depending on the barrel length and the distance. There are a lot of debates over that, but the great benefit is it's half the weight of typical full power rifle ammo, and it's lighter even than the AK round, and you can get a 30-round magazine that's more compact than that great big banana-shaped thing that hangs off the bottom of an AK. So that's 5.56. Lethal enough for most purposes. Now, very similar, in fact. So directly following on from the American/NATO 5.56 round is this, the then Soviet 5.45mm round. So very similar capabilities to 5.56, very little to choose between them. The Soviets went with a slightly narrower bullet, slightly smaller in diameter, but they lengthened the bullet to bring it up to a very similar mass. So very similar ballistic effect, exterior ballistics, very similar trajectory-wise, accuracy-wise, and then terminal effect-wise, wounds caused by either of these are, well, potentially indistinguishable, but very similar in terms of destructive power. They kept the same case length, 39mm, as the earlier AK round, to make compatibility easier and to make the redesign from the AKM rifle into the AK-74 rifle easier. And just to be clear, although pistol caliber rounds are less damaging than any of these, and these two are all likely to be more damaging than this, you absolutely don't want to get shot by any of them.
Hear, hear to that. These trophy weapons are lethal souvenirs of a war that has caused more than 1 million casualties, and as yet has no sign of ending.